In the decades which preceded the Clone Wars, the galaxy-spanning conflict which marked the twilight of the Jedi, several influential figures would rise from inauspicious beginnings to lead, shape, and personify the power of the Order. Some returned to the service of their birth worlds, where their names became synonymous with the guardianship of peace and justice. Some were famed beyond the halls of the Jedi Temple, their names known to the galactic populace, rumors of their doings having reached the ears of the common beings whom they served. Others were known primarily only to fellow members of the Order, their names whispered by the reverent and awestruck Padawans of the age. Figures who had dared or risked much over the course of their service and had achieved even more, only to one day make the ultimate sacrifice. In their time, they were heroes, immortal in the eyes of their Jedi brethren. For a time, the Jedi Knight Sharad Hett stood tall among their number. The Padawan learner of the Jedi Master Eeth Koth, Sharad Hett was the young son of a family whose homeworld had produced many Jedi. By custom, it was said that the family whose child was raised in the service of the Order was envied by all. The Hetts had been proud to be among those so honored. An adventurous and courageous Zabrak, Eeth Koth had joined the Order at the relatively advanced age of 4. An orphan from the smuggler's moon, Nar Shaddaa, Koth was perhaps more sensitive than most of his colleagues where the subjects of parental and familial bonds were concerned. As a result, the young Sharad was allowed to remain in contact with his family with his master's encouragement. However, as one of the most esteemed Jedi of his time, Master Koth's abilities often saw him called into action where his skills were most dearly needed. Sectors of space located on the fringes of civilization. These adventures, which quickly became the stuff of legend, earned the talented young Jedi a number of alternate monikers, such as the Howlrunner or the Hound of Worlds. As a direct consequence of these extensive periods of active service, visits to Sharad Hett's family became far less frequent, and while his actions earned him the respect of his peers, over time, he began to feel a deep sense of loss. Sharad Hett's doubts prompted him to throw himself into his service with even greater vigor, an unsuccessful attempt to ease his troubled mind. His continual acts of daring garnered him the accolades of his peers and their starry-eyed Padawans. Sharad Hett himself grew uneasy with this attention and chafed at the increased influence his reputation had afforded him. Lionization ran counter to the selfless principles of the Jedi philosophy. He found this combination to be a potentially alluring and seductive link to the dark side of the Force. When he could no longer tolerate the disturbing thoughts that swirled within his mind, he decided he would need a change. His former master, Eeth Koth, arranged for Sharad Hett to take a leave of absence from the Jedi Order. Though Koth could not truly understand his student's frame of mind, he apologized for any pain he had unknowingly caused throughout their turbulent years of service together. Upon deciding to return to the planet of his birth, Sharad Hett discovered that his home had been attacked by a band of rivals who had razed every major city to the ground. His entire family was dead. Of what use are a Jedi's powers if he cannot save his own family? These words, and his newfound clarity and conviction, drove Hett to leave Coruscant behind forever. Eventually, he crash-landed in the deserts of Tatooine, where his struggle to survive caught the attention of the Tusken Raiders. After months of observing the strange outsider, the tribe adopted Hett as one of their own. Having nowhere else to go, Hett used his force powers and combative abilities to claw his way to a position of respect within the clan. As the Sand People taught him the ancient ways of the Dune Sea, he passed down to them new skills he'd acquired during his time as a Jedi. Although human by birth, with the tribe's blessing, Hett became a Tusken, and approximately 15 years before the instigation of the Naboo crisis, Sharad married another human female who had grown into a Tusken warrior. Through her, Sharad Hett would sire his only child, his son, Asharad. Years after settling on Tatooine, and shortly after the death of Qui-Gon Jinn and the initiation of Anakin Skywalker into the Jedi Order, Hett's former masters learned of his continued survival. Identified by his personal hand-built lightsaber through mysterious recordings which depicted the famous Jedi leading Tusken Raiders into battle, Sharad Hett's actions spurred the Jedi Council to take action. Believing that an unbiased operative would be required to deal with a possible threat, the Council turned to the only one among their number who had no prior personal relationship to Sharad Hett, the Syrian Jedi, Ki-Adi-Mundi. Discovered and introduced to the Order by the mysterious Dark Woman, Ki-Adi-Mundi was one of the most unusual Jedi of his time, in more ways than one. Perhaps the greatest distinction he carried was the fact that as a result of the low birth rate of his species, accompanied by a ratio that saw only one male Syrian born for every 20 females, Mundi had been allowed to take not merely one bride, but several, in order to father children. Having filled in on an only temporary basis during the absence of Micah Giet, Mundi was not yet a master when he first sat upon the Jedi High Council. Because of this, he had not been present on the body in the days when Sharad Hett had been among the rising stars of the Jedi Order. Irrespective of whatever Sharad Hett's motives for going to war may have been, Ki-Adi-Mundi had his own reasons to be mindful of Tatooine's dangers. The Syrian Jedi had had dealings in the past with the notorious crime lord, Jabba the Silajik Tayur, more commonly known as Jabba the Hutt. The gangster had, in Mundi's own words, defiled one of the Jedi's many daughters. In addition, the strange planet had very recently played host to two ominous developments: the rediscovery of the existence of the Sith Order, and the new discovery of the possible chosen one of Jedi prophecy, the former slave boy, Anakin Skywalker. Shortly after receiving his instructions from Masters Eeth, Koth, and Yoda, Mundi set out to uncover the truth behind Sharad Hett's attacks on the settlers of Tatooine. Tatooine's rich history predated the founding of the Galactic Republic. Though once lush and full of life, the planet was decimated during an orbital strike enacted by the barbaric Rakatans. The Rakatans had been the builders of the ancient superweapon known as the Starforge, and the rulers of the so-called Infinite Empire, the first known galactic government which collapsed more than 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Over the millennia that followed, Tatooine had found itself occupied by a multitude of colonization efforts, most of which resulted in failure. Bought, traded, or passed over by large conglomerates and mining corporations during the Republic's infancy, and later settled by moisture farmers, merchants, and a variety of others hoping to eke out a living, Tatooine was seen as little more than a worthless ball of burning dust to most. In the final years which had preceded the discovery of Anakin Skywalker, the one-time slave turned Jedi Knight was originally introduced to the harsh, desolate world by his former owner, Gardulla Bisadi the Elder. A longtime rival of Jabba's, Gardulla had decades earlier instituted the renaissance of an annual pod racing event, the Bunta Eve Classic at Mos Espa, the largest and most profitable race of its kind in the galaxy. Commissioned by the Hutts using credits loaned to Gardulla by the Mune financier Higo Damask, the race had been planned as a venture that would fill the Hutts' coffers to overflowing, and a percentage of those profits were to be directed back to the enterprising old Mune. Unbeknownst to Gardulla, Higo Damask, the Magister of Damask Holdings, was in actuality the reigning Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Plagueis. A notorious gambler, Gardulla would lose a great deal of her vast wealth over the decades that followed, through a series of poorly placed bets and failed ventures. Because of this, she would never hold up her end of the bargain she had struck with Darth Plagueis. Realizing this, and smelling blood, Her old rival Jabba made a bid for her territory in order to claim Tatooine for his own. Jabba provided information and resources that allowed the Sith Lord to evade an assassination attempt leveled against him by Gardulla and her allies, which included members of the Black Sun crime syndicate and the King of Naboo himself, each of whom had their reasons for wanting to see Damask dead. In return, Darth Plagueis, in his guise as Higo Damask, rewarded Jabba by cutting off Gardulla's funding once and for all. This provided Jabba with the opening he needed to take control of the desert planet, which became something of a haven for pirates and smugglers, among other things. This was the state of affairs when Ki-Adi-Mundi came to Tatooine in search of the Jedi gone renegade, Sharad Hett. And because the world was now under the control of Jabba the Hutt, Mundi was forced to arrange for safe passage into the desert by meeting with the aged criminal in person. Although it had indeed been against Mundi's better judgment to accept the offer, few options were available to him. It wasn't long before his suspicions proved to be correct, however, and Mundi found himself facing a group of cutthroats and mercenaries in the employ of the Hutt. The timing of their attack coincided with the coming of a sandstorm, and although Mundi fought his way out of the trap, he did not emerge entirely unscathed. Injured and stranded in the midst of the Jandaland wastes, Mundi pressed on with his search for Sharad Hett, drawing heavily upon his Jedi training to survive the perils of the desert. As Mundi drew closer to the Tusken settlement, he inadvertently stumbled into the cave of a krayt dragon mother, one of the most ferocious of Tatooine's predators. The ordeal finally brought Mundi into contact with his own quarry, who as it happened had been tracking the krayt dragon with a small band of Tusken comrades. At first, Sharad Hett toyed with Mundi by casually explaining how and why the krayt dragon would attack the hapless Jedi. Hett had incorrectly assumed that the Council had dispatched Mundi to hunt him down and eliminate him, and so quite apart from wanting to assist Mundi, Hett seemed almost amused by the predicament the Jedi Knight had gotten himself into. It wasn't until Ki-Adi-Mundi revealed that Masters Yoda and Eeth Koth had sent him in peace that Sharad Hett finally intervened. Motivated by his loyalty and love for Master Koth, Sharad Hett leapt into action with a young Tusken initiate by his side, his son, Asharad. With Mundi now watching from the sidelines, the pair fended off the dangerous creature. It had been the rule of long standing that any Tusken warrior could assist in the hunt for a krayt dragon, and any among the hunting party could draw first blood. But by tradition, the kill would have to be made by the initiate, and the blow would have to be struck using the ancestral weapon of the Tusken Raiders, the Gadurfi stick. Although Mundi protested, wishing to help the boy, Sharad Hett insisted that the youth would have to accomplish this on his own. It was his rite of passage. He would earn the mantle of Tusken warrior. Although the battle was bloody, and one of his Tusken brothers was maimed in the fighting, the boy emerged victorious, claiming the krayt dragon's pearl as his trophy. The following day, Sharad Hett began the process of explaining himself to Mundi, who could not yet understand the reason for the Tusken Raiders' skirmishes with the off-world settlers. Hett told Mundi about his harrowing life story, the reason for his departure from the Order, his marriage to Asharad's now deceased mother, and how remarkably strong the boy was in the Force. Sharad Hett also explained that like his son, he was both a Jedi Knight and a Tusken warrior, and although he was the tribe's chief, he was merely their war leader, not their king. Slowly, Ki-Adi-Mundi came to accept that there was no malice in Sharad Hett's heart. But still, Mundi did not understand what had caused the fighting between the Tuskens and the settlers in the first place. In response to the Jedi's question, Hett led Mundi to a Tusken burial site. While unremarkable in and of itself, Hett explained that the burial site was merely one of many similar such locations, and that only a year ago, 100 of those claims had not existed. Someone had started to attack the Tusken camps. They had poisoned the water in the wells. They had left disease-infected food for the Tuskens to find. Sickeningly, they had also left similarly contaminated toys for the tribe's children to discover as well. When the tribes of the Junlan Wastes called for retribution in response to this outrage, Sharad Hett declined to stop them, and as he was now a Tusken himself, he could even sympathize with them. However, as Hett himself pointed out many times, he was still a Jedi every bit as much as he was a Tusken, and he was not blind to the terrible vengeance that his followers would exact upon their enemies if allowed to go unchecked. The Tuskens were, in Sharad Hett's own words, masters of torture who had over the years adopted methods of warfare which even he considered to be nightmarishly extreme. Sharad Hett took control to prevent such atrocities from being carried out. Hett also explained that although it had not looked like it, his attacks had actually been very carefully coordinated, and the targets were chosen specifically to weaken the staging points used by their enemies. Impressively, Sharad Hett was able to limit the casualties. Most of the fallen had been thugs and militiamen, whose skill had made them too dangerous to be ignored during the battle. Similarly, the Jawa merchants who were targeted were distributing black market weapons. Regrettably, despite Hett's best efforts, a few innocent farmers were killed in the ensuing chaos. Although Sharad attempted to justify these losses by reminding himself that the men were buying guns with the intent of killing Tuskens, he still saw the tragic waste of life for what it was. No matter the case, Hett believed his fight was just and his role in the conflict a necessary one. Although he could not prevent the war, he would not allow his followers to devolve. He would let them fight, but he would see to it that their war did not become a rampage. The Jedi had determined that Jabba had initiated the fighting by orchestrating the early acts of aggression against the Tusken tribes, but Mundi could not guess at the criminal's motives. Hett, however, believed he knew the answer. Caches of cheap, outdated weaponry had been recovered by Hett's forces in the aftermath of the skirmishes. Hett suspected that Jabba had triggered this war between the Tuskens and the Outlander settlements to create a need for the weapons where none had existed previously. Because of the planet's lackluster geophysical qualities, Tatooine was of little interest to the Republic or corporations. Devoid of valuable resources or precious metals to plunder, it had been looked over. But in the eyes of the Hutts, Tatooine was a gold mine. Tatooine bordered several key hyperspace jump points, and most who traveled into or out of the Outer Rim territories passed through Tatooine. There the Republic had no power. Black market smuggling was facilitated. No laws prohibited the buying or selling of slaves. Fugitives could be safely hidden. Pod racing and gambling flourished. While several Hutts operated on Tatooine, the world was primarily under Jabba's control. He wished to keep it that way. One of the measures Jabba took with this end in mind was the forging of new alliances with the most powerful of Nal Hutta's crime bosses. One such figure was the Hutt named Dreadon. Dreadon had made arrangements to supply a fringe group of Arcanian rebels with his weaponry. However, the group was toppled before the delivery could be made. As a result, the Hutts found themselves stuck with the goods, which were now both overpriced and obsolete. Jabba formulated a plan, a simple plan. Start a war with the Tuskens and blame it on the Outlanders. The vengeful Tuskens would raid the nearest towns, inciting further violence and panic in the hearts and minds of the settlers. Then, supply the settlers with Dreadon's junk weaponry. Dreadon eliminates his surplus stocks. Tatooine grows more dependent on the Hutts. The Nal Hutta bosses profit. Jabba is their hero and gains their support. That was the idea. But some rivalries run too deeply to be so easily forgotten. Gardulla had built much of what Tatooine was, and she wanted it back. But in order to accomplish this, she would also need the support of the Nal Hutta crime bosses. Her plan was to break through the Tusken Raider defenses with her forces and eliminate as many warriors as possible, thus freeing up her own agent to take out the leader of the Tusken forces. Taking advantage of the rumor that the Tusken chief was actually a Jedi Knight, Gardulla had enticed the former Padawan turned bounty hunter Aurra Sing into accepting a contract. With the death of Sharad Hett, Gardulla hoped she would be free to finish what Jabba had started and emerge as the most esteemed Hutt based on Tatooine once again. As all of the pieces began to fall into place, and the bigger picture began to become more clear, Ki-Adi-Mundi better understood the reasons for Sharad Hett's actions, but he encouraged Hett to return with him to Coruscant all the same. He explained that the Order needed his help now more than ever due to the recent return of the Sith. Although the revelation concerning the return of the Sith had been deeply troubling to Sharad Hett, he refused to turn his back on his new family. However, the debate was cut short by the arrival of an army of mercenary forces, led by Gardulla herself. Sharad Hett, who realized that his warriors were woefully unprepared for the coming battle, charged forward to rally his forces and take command from the front. Leading his followers through the thickest of the fighting, he carved his way through Gardulla's forces until he reached the criminal's floating skiff, where he was brought down by a shot from an unseen sniper. The Jedi hunter, Aurra Sing. The Hutt's moment of triumph was short-lived, however, as Aurra Sing had double-crossed her by selling information regarding Gardulla's plan to her old rival. Jabba and his own army arrived late to the battle to ensure he retained control over Tatooine. Enraged and ashamed by this final embarrassment, Gardulla retreated shortly thereafter, but not before confronting Aurra Sing. Sing cared very little for the Hutt's words, but returned half of Gardulla's payment all the same. Her animosity for the Jedi went beyond the promise of credits. Any chance to kill a Jedi was enough to prompt Aurra Sing into action. Although she had, in her own words, clipped Hett's wings, she was determined that her Jedi enemy should die with honor. Engaging in a final lightsaber duel, Sharad Hett put up a worthy effort despite his injuries. As their duel progressed with no clear victor in sight, Aurra Sing lost interest in her notion of honor. Relying on a devious trick, her favorite tactic for when she got in over her head, Aurra Sing used the Force to off-balance the legendary renegade. This gave her the opening she had been looking for. As she was in the process of recovering the fallen Jedi's lightsaber, she was interrupted by Ki-Adi-Mundi and Sharad Hett's son, Asharad. Hoping to lure the boy down into the same darkness that had claimed her so long ago, Aurra Sing encouraged the young man to strike her down. With the intervention of Ki-Adi-Mundi, Sharad Hett resisted the call of darkness, at least for the moment. Taking advantage of a distracted opponent once again, Aurra Sing escaped into the vast reaches of the desert. As Sharad Hett lay dying, Mundi and the younger Hett approached the fallen Tusken chief. Few members of the tribe had survived the battle. The clan had been broken. Jabba had succeeded. Sharad asked his son what he intended to do. Asharad decided to journey to Coruscant with Ki-Adi-Mundi, who pledged to finish what his father had started and see to it that Asharad completed his Jedi training. As a final gesture, Sharad Hett entrusted his hand-built lightsaber to his son and asked him to promise never to use the weapon in anger nor for vengeance. Finally, the exile told Sharad Hett that while he had never truly known his own parents, he had been honored to have known his son. One of the things that I enjoy about the EU are the subtle parallels that the writers and authors who worked within that mythos managed to draw between their own new works and the classic films themselves. This continued on when the prequels came about, only in these cases, the works that were created to coincide with or pair up with the films typically ended up being produced with consistently and considerably better quality. The story of Outlander, The Exile of Sharad Hett, was no exception to that. If you look at the nature of the relationship between Sharad Hett and his son, and the multitude of stories that ended up springboarding from that point, you'll find that the story was really a far more interesting and well-conceived version of the same approximate story that was present in The Phantom Menace. An evil genius creates a false crisis of which the actual fighting involved is truly inconsequential. The entire ordeal is only meant to benefit the previously mentioned evil genius. A Jedi finds himself attempting to unravel a vague mystery on Tatooine. And while they are troubled by the planet's lawlessness, there's really very little they can do to change that due to the current political climate. And of course, during the execution of their missions, they both encountered young men who were initially raised by single parents, only to join the Order in the days leading up to the twilight of the Jedi, and both went on to become two of the most influential Sith Lords in galactic history. While it's clear that each of these parallels weren't necessarily intended at the time, it goes to show what writers can accomplish when they're passionate about something and have a genuine interest in the setting's continuity. The story opened the door for further explorations of the characters and parallels that seemed heartfelt and natural to the mythos. Little or none of what grew out of this tale came off as contrived. On a side note, the antagonists involved in this story made for a very nice change of pace as well. Now, there's nothing exactly wrong with a Sith Lord prattling on about something dark side or whatever, but having the Sith Lord merely coloring the story in a very indirect manner through having brokered financial deals with the Hutts, and having Gardulla and Jabba, of all characters, each as the true masterminds behind the plotting, backstabbing, and general lawlessness that made Tatooine what it was at this point in the timeline, felt more natural and realistic. It felt more true to the setting. It was one of the stronger examples of a story that raised moral and ethical questions by exploring a war without what is effectively a dark wizard with strange force powers and a red lightsaber and a black outfit pulling the strings, which kind of removes the question of ambiguity as to who the bad guys really are, if you're kind of trying to go for that sort of thing anyway. Having said that, what made these questions interesting in the first place were the actions of our heroes, not our villains. Whether or not Sharad Hett's actions were justified is a question the story poses to the readers, and it's for the readers to think over and discuss. The villains, while simplistic in terms of their motives, are to be applauded for putting the protagonist into this predicament. While certainly not as charismatic or enticing as the Dark Lords of the Sith, the Hutts were also deceptively clever and manipulative, given their extremely basic motivation, that being simple greed, of course. The implication that came along with the methodology that was used by the Hutts' forces to instigate the war, such as the poisoned water wells or the purposely contaminated toys which were meant to target Tusken children, all of these things undermined that flimsy defense that George Lucas would often pull out whenever Star Wars came under fire. The claim that Star Wars is for kids, his excuse to deflect criticism. It can be understood by kids, but I think it's a mistake to cater Star Wars to them. This story clearly did not, and that's one of the reasons I can still enjoy it as an adult all these years later. As well, one thing that I find especially interesting and poetic is again the subtle parallel in the way that the stories of father and son both unfolded. Sharad Hett lost everything and latched onto a new family after withdrawing from the Jedi Order, and he defended that new family until the moment he drew his last breath. Sharad lost everything twice, following Jabba's attack and later after he joined the Jedi Order and defended it in the aftermath of Order 66. And while he embraced the ideals of the Sith later on, it is debatable that his vision for what the Sith should become and the practices he used to instruct his followers were outgrowths of a very corrupted Jedi philosophy. Sharad went directly against the vow he'd made to his father, the vow to never strike in anger nor in vengeance. Darth Krayt, the being that Sharad became, showed us a portrait of someone with incredible strength in the Force, and what happens when that person experiences loss and abject loneliness. He attempted to project that same pain onto everybody else in the galaxy, becoming one of the most warped Sith Lords in the entirety of the setting. Of course, Sharad Hett could never have known that would happen. All he saw in his son was a young, though untested man in whom it was possible to invest every conceivable hope and expectation. While the son unquestionably lost his way, in my mind he joined the ranks of those controversial figures throughout the setting's history, such as Ulic Qel-Droma or Anakin Skywalker, whose actions, while truly monstrous at times, did not and perhaps could not entirely wash out all the good they had also accomplished. It is for this reason that I do not believe Sharad Hett gave his life in vain. And although he would not have wished it to be this way, when comparing the two, Sharad Hett remains the better Jedi, more importantly, the better man. One who in the end lived up to his own legend. It is possible he could never have been able to do that, if not for the hope and pride his son endowed him with. While Sharad sadly lost his way, he gave his father something to believe in. There is so much to this particular story, from the exploration of Tusken culture to the moral and ethical questions raised by Sharad Hett's actions. While not as complex nor quite as dark, it is a story with the same overtones as Matthew Stover's masterwork, Shatterpoint. All of these things, and several more I can't mention just now, make the story of Sharad Hett one that is easy for me to recommend to just about anybody. While I'm sure that we all find different sources of enjoyment in the various stories that we love, one concept I think we can all empathize with is the one that best encapsulates Sharad Hett's reason for departing from the Jedi Order in the first place. If any of you are also fans of the Mass Effect series, you will likely already agree that there are a lot of things that made the character of Mordin Solus truly awesome. But for now, I'd like to draw your attention to one particular quote, one of the reasons Mordin gave for fighting against the Reapers, one of the things that allowed him to focus against an enemy on that sort of massive scale.
Are you calling him because you're worried we won't make it back?
No, aware survival unlikely, but actually contacted him for family connection. Hard to imagine galaxy. Too many people, faceless, statistics easy to depersonalize. Good when doing unpleasant work. For this fight, want personal connection. Can't anthropomorphize galaxy, but can think of favorite nephew. Fighting for him.
Unlike so many others, Sharad Hett did not leave the Jedi because he fell to the dark side, nor for any political reasons, or even because he disagreed with the Council. His reason was of a much more personal and even mundane nature. The desire for a personal connection and the strength that bonds like those can, under the right circumstances, impart. In Sharad Hett's case, it simply wasn't enough to fight out of duty or because of an oath. He needed something to fight for, someone to fight for.